start if everybody is good, and I have closed captioning set, and I don't know how I did that, but you're welcome. Accessibility wins. We have,
Yes, it's saying what you're saying.
yes, it is saying what I'm saying, so I had better behave because it will be recorded, well, not recorded, but no, it will be recorded because they're recording.
It's pretty quick.
It is, it's pretty good, isn't it? I now watch all shows with subtitles on because I miss things.
I need you to come up to my house and show me how to do that.
Okay.
We just can't always understand these people, especially younger generation, they talk so fast. It's hard to understand, so we have to close captioning.
She's amazing.
Well, we like a lot of like international programming, and so it's helpful.
Someone's got an accent too.
Yeah, especially if it's a very thick northern UK accent, I sometimes miss things. It's like, I think you have context clues. I don't know if she has that. Let's see if it's gonna move.
We use bidding.
Oh, it's an owl.
Yes, I wasn't sure. Sometimes they. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and just start, and then we can back up if we need to. The title I have selected is because in my family, being a primrose is not something you aspire to. Anytime I scraped a knee or was just generally being too sensitive, I was told, don't be a primrose. And it is not primrose like the little flower, it's still being primrose. So, looking back over my family tree and my ancestors, I realized that there are no primroses in there. We could shake that tree till all the leaves came down and we're not going to find a single primrose. So I wanted to share with you information that I have learned about women. Oh, hi, Dale.
Hi there. 12 o'clock, right?
Yeah, it's 12.
Oh. Yes.
Hello, come on in. All right, well, I now know at least 3 of us are descended from Miss Mary Moody. Possibly more. I wouldn't be surprised. Dale, I was just telling them that in my family, you don't want to be a primrose, so I titled this No Primroses because among the women in my ancestry, there were no primroses. So just a little bit of a history lesson. Pennsylvania was founded in 1681 when King Charles granted land to William Penn the Elder. This was not a gift. This was the king owed William Penn the Elder money. So Pennsylvania was what paid that debt off. William Penn arrived in 1682 and established the settlement of Philadelphia. Now, the western frontier of the state opened up, and the way that looked was forts were established, and then settlers would come in and settle in the vicinity of a fort. So women were on the Pennsylvania frontier relatively early and not necessarily as weaker partners. This is a passage I found in a book that I've come to love. Some of the wording is a little antiquated, but it's a good vignette of what it would look like for a couple to arrive on the frontier. From a sky as blue as chicory in the grass, sunlight fell across a clearing and reached golden fingers back amongst the trees. The clearing itself, its leaf molded surface, was marked with fresh cut stumps and littered with yellow flakes and chips that the axe had cut from trunks piled roughly to one side, trunks not yet trimmed of the branches and freshly pointed from the blows of the axe. On one of the stumps, the clearing sat, or I'm sorry, on one of the stumps in the clearing sat a man and his wife. The sleeve of his linsey hunting shirt was ripped. His brown leggings were half hidden by the blue folds of her full rough skirt, and his feet in their scuffed shoe packs braced the ground for support as if he were ready to spring erect at a sound. This is a cabin that would be very reminiscent of what would have been built in this area when the first settlers were coming in. They were not fancy, they were very utilitarian. Often windows were non-existent or simply a hole in the wall with wooden shutters to close. They were purely built for emergency shelter, and this would have been one of the first things that a settler would have got to work doing when they got here. What I would like to point out is, you really would be hard pressed to build a cabin like that by yourself, now wouldn't you? And if a couple were coming onto the frontier where there were very few neighbors, who would help build that cabin? Because the man surely didn't do it himself. And that's a lot of work, and that is not the work of a weak, unable person. So, what did frontier women do? Question would be better put, what didn't they do? Every part of providing for themselves and their family had to be planned in advance. Water had to be carried. And that's a big job. Water's very heavy. And you need to plan not only for drinking, for washing, for cooking. So that all needs to be brought in, probably first thing in the morning, because you're going to want the sediment to lay down at the bottom so you don't have sludgy water. Planting. Not only are they planting for food, we're planting for clothing. Flax was a very popular crop amongst homesteaders in Pennsylvania. It was a readily available fiber for clothing, but it took a lot of work to get that from planting to leaving. The plants have to be cut at a very specific time in the growth cycle. Then the plants have to be bound, soaked in water for 3 days, brought out and dried for a number of days. Then they have to be beaten and broken so that the fibers can be pulled from the stalks. Once they're pulled from the stalks, it's a lot like wool. They have to be parted and spun and woven. So harvesting, all that you plant, you have to be able to harvest. And while men would have been most likely working with the cash crops, and the women would have been out there too. But the garden typically was the domain of the woman. So that's food, clothing, also medicines and herbs. You have to process everything because everything's in a raw state. Cooking. Cooking over an open hearth, which would have been a luxury in this situation, involved really heavy cast iron cookery. They are literally playing with fire. They're scraping coals out onto the hearth to put a Dutch oven over, scraping back. They're calculating how high they want the fire for what they're doing. That's if they have the hearth. If this is a very rustic setup, they're cooking over an outdoor fire, and it could be deadly. Long skirts caught fire all the time. Preserving all of your foodstuffs have to be processed so that they're going to last you the winter. Healing. If somebody gets a gash on their arm, a burn, a broken limb, all of that is on the woman of the house to figure out what she's going to do. So there had to be a rudimentary knowledge of best treatment, and there were a lot of old wives' tales, so sometimes the best practices were not best practices. Organizing. if you're in a cabin that size, where do you put enough provisions to last you the winter? You've got to be a spectacular organizer. Even if you're using a root cellar, you've still got your cheese, your flour, all of the things that you need to protect from rodents and you need your eyes on them, those are all going in your cabin. Weaving, sewing, child rearing, teaching. Also, they did everything the men were doing, but while wearing skirts. And probably with a baby on their hip. So, I have a challenge for you, and we'll discount this to 3. Can you name 5 historical, well-known American women who lived in the 1700s?
Abigail Adams.
Mm-hmm,
Dolly Madison.
mm-hmm.
Martha Washington.
Okay.
She lost.
Mhm. Now, can you name 5 historical, well-known American men who lived in the 1700s? That's pretty easy. Okay, so which was easier to come to mind?
Men.
Why?
Their lives were chronicled, women's lives were not.
Okay, the women that were, their lives were chronicled, what did they all have in common?
The famous husband, yes.
Yeah.
They had wealth, they had privilege. And those are the only women that we ever tend to hear about. So now we're gonna focus on one woman's story. Who was Mary Moody? So, as the case is with many women in our history, we have to begin at the end. So here is Mary Moody Norris's tombstone. I am not confident that that is her original tombstone. I don't know what date that may carry to. Dale, do you know?
That should be the original.
It should be the original, okay. Mary, wife of Joe Norris, died December 17th, 1817, in the 87th year of her age. Which, can we just, yeah, 87. That's pretty impressive. For an era with no antibiotics, no vaccines, and a rough life. So,
Oh, good,
we'll hope.
I did.
Yeah. So she was originally interred in the family cemetery near their farm, which was located roughly in the area of 7 Points. But when the lake came in, the graves were moved to Jacob's Church, which would have been, I think, around 1973. So that is where her stone and her grave is now marked. It's very near her husband, Joseph, and some of her children. So, from Mary to me, there's quite a bit of space. But what I found was just interesting here, because I like statistics a little bit, as long as I can just not have to calculate them myself.
See better.
So each of us has 256 6x great grandparents. Including Mary's generation, it took 510 people to get from her to me. Which it takes a village. So Mary's descendants most likely surpass 1,000. I sat and tried to calculate, and when I got to about 600 or 700, I knew I was missing a lot. So we're going to say, I think it's a safe bet to say 1,000 descendants of Mary Moody or probably have walked the earth since her time. And many of them still live in this area.
So we should believe people on Facebook that say, I'm related to like Henry II or whatever.
Not necessarily, but in local genealogy, especially what I found in Huntingdon County for the most part, many of my ancestors arrived in Huntingdon County between 1750 and 1770. And those progenitors have been very well documented, and a lot of DAR work went into, qualifying and certifying. I can't now, for instance, there's her husband Joseph Norris. We're confident we know who his father is, but there's a lot of speculation once you get past his father. He came from either Ireland, England, Mars, I don't know. So we started at the end, so then I wanted to go find her beginning. A lot of Mary's descendants have carried on that she was born in Wales. Looking at the records in Wales for the dates that we were looking for, I could not find anything. What I could find was a christening record from Gloucestershire in the UK, which is on near the bank of the River Severn, which is the border between England and Wales. Pure speculation here, but I suspect strongly that she identified as Welsh because living in Revolutionary era colonies, she probably wanted to differentiate herself from the British. And she lived on the border. She may have had ancestors from Wales. So it was a reasonable guess. But this is her christening record, Mary of William and Mary Moody. She was born November 30th, 1730, and christened March 24th, 1731. I have been writing, just trying to fill out who she was a little bit, but this is just something I wrote to try and engage my imagination and picture who she was. But ushering in both good and ill for millennia, the River Severn's tidal waterway between England and Wales, conveying Roman bayous, Viking longboats, schooners, and barges, it's very likely Mary had the opportunity to watch ships laden with goods arriving or departing via the Severn. It's extremely unlikely that Mary or her ancestors, who had made their livelihoods within a 20-mile radius of the English countryside for generations, would have ever imagined that the River Severn would have transported her to a life more than 3,000 miles away to the banks of the Gracetown branch of the Virginia River. And it's very likely, as you'll see later, that she did travel via the River Severn on the way out. So, life at home. Gloucestershire was a wool cottage industry village right on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. And cottage industry literally means the industry went from cottage to cottage. Sheep would be sheared, the wool would be delivered to the person in the village who did the carding, who did the washing, who did the pulling, who did the spinning, who did the dyeing. So it's very, very, very likely that from a young age, Mary's young hands were put to work carding wool for somebody in her neighborhood to make a little extra pocket money. It's hard to read the document there, but you'll notice in the list of her siblings and her, there is a gap between Mary and her sister Anne of about 5 years, and that coincides with this record from the jail. Her father spent some time in prison for, let me get this right, I believe it was harassing his neighbors, being indigent and harassing his neighbors. So whether that meant he had an alcohol problem or had a mental illness, I don't know, but William spent some time in jail. I don't know how long that was, but that gap, but there's another gap later on of about 4 years, but that coincides nicely with in going to jail. Which I can only imagine would have been a very, very difficult time for her family. She had a sister Esther, a brother Daniel, a brother Isaac, a brother John, a sister Elizabeth, a younger sister Anne, and then there were the twins, Jane and Sarah. You'll note on the birth dates and death dates that 3 children died in the span of 1739 to 1740. And then in 1748 and 1749, 2 more died. Sarah's christening date is on the same sheet of paper as her burial date. She lived a matter of about 6 weeks. So Mary's journey to the New World. This has been a little kind of my brick wall that I've had to come to some closure that is probably not going to solve it. I have had 3 conversations with historians at the Maryland Archive, and they shared their speculation with me that Mary was most likely transported for a petty crime at some point in her young life. Around this era, from 1718, although the colonies received convicts, only a few went to New England. Approximately 97% of those transported went to Virginia or Maryland, where there was a continual demand for cheap, white bonded labor and skilled and semi-skilled farming tasks and for domestic work. And that's from a book called Harlots, Hussies, and Poor Unfortunate Women. The market for transported labor was high. The attitudes in England during that time toward poverty were that it was a moral failing. So their understanding of the best way to get rid of poverty was to get rid of poor people. So in the 1740s, a lot of laws went into effect, changing domain of public lands to private. So the lands where poor people would go pick up kindling or snare rabbits, or the fact that they would pick up coal that fell off of the coal carts, that was all now a felony. Now, just wrap your head around the fact that most of the people that these laws impacted could not read. So how were they to know that these laws had changed? And the fact of the matter is they weren't meant to. This was a trap. This was meant to trap people into breaking the law so that they could then be shipped off to Australia or the colonies in the United States. It's not the United States. So this book cover illustrates what these hearings likely look like. Just a young person pulled up in front of a magistrate, not really given a chance to speak. I mean, what could they say? Children as young as 11 were transported, and an indenture was 7 years of your life. We don't know when Mary was transported, but the working theory is Mary arrived, and we know that Mary married Joseph Norris in 1749. Her parents are still in the UK, or still in England. None of her siblings are here with her. So we have a 19-year-old getting married in Maryland with no family. There is no other reality under which she got here on her own power, other than transportation. She would not have been of a economic status to be essentially a mail order bride. She would have had no dowry to make that attractive. So at some point between 11 and 19, Mary was transported from England to the UK, to Maryland. The historian that I spoke to feels that it was most likely not a violent crime because there are no records of it. There are records of a 15-year-old girl who was a highwayman for a time and was transported to Maryland. But it's much more likely that Mary ran afoul of some law that, whether she stole food or picked up kindling on private land, something fairly benign, and most likely that she either didn't think was going to be as severely punishable as it was, or she didn't know it was going to be punished at all. I look at the years of the loss of her siblings, and I tear up when I think about her mother, because her transportation most likely took place in that window of the 3 siblings dying and the 2 siblings dying. So it must have felt like some sort of curse that she lost these children to death. She lost Mary to the system, and then lost 2 more children. And I don't know what she was dealing with her husband, if that was a one-off or if he just was a mess, but, let me be fair though. It does look like he did have gainful employment as a fuller later on, so it may have just been, could have been a vendetta by a neighbor, who knows? So the other thing I learned from the archives is the only way an indentured servant could get married before their 7 years was up is if their spouse or his family or her family purchased the indenture or paid it off, because this is essentially a mortgage, and the indentures are actually stored in the same section of the archives as mortgages. Now Mary's is not present there, but indentures, when a person purchased an indenture, the paper was ripped in half. Half of that paper went to the person who was owned by the indenture, and the other half went to the owner. My guess is there would not be a lot of incentive. This is not a happy memory. So it just may not have been preserved anywhere. So I have not been able to uncover a lot of Mary's life in Maryland, but they did live there for almost 30 years. Most of their children were born in Maryland. And it does look like they did pretty well for themselves there. They owned land along the Potomac River. And they appear, for all intents and purposes, like they were rubbing elbows with the founder of Sharpsburg, Maryland. At the time Sharpsburg was founded. So there were good relationships, good investments. Joseph swore his oath of fidelity to the colony. He was not a British sympathizer. We do know that the farm at 7 Points was previously established by another family. That family were killed in a raid by local indigenous people. Now, the account of that raid is that this family had company over, they had neighbors over. The couple and their younger children were killed. But the guests swore their loyalty to the crown, and they were just taken captive. It is known that the British were manipulating indigenous tribes, providing them with arms, and telling them that if you harass these colonists, we're gonna get them out of we're gonna give you your land back. So the story tracks that the people who swore loyalty to the crown were spared. It does not mention whether there was a similar, swearing of loyalty to the other side by the owners of the farm, but I'm not sure they would have, that really didn't present the story they wanted to tell. The older brother or the older siblings were not home. They inherited the farm, but I get the impression from the paperwork that they were either not interested in farming that land or not able to. Because what we see around 1785-ish is that the Norrises lease that land and they start heading up. And you can see well, they're called Indian paths. And I wish I had an overlay because you can see most of our modern highways still utilize those. That is the same way because they went with the landscape. But coming up from Sharpsburg, the Norrises would have traveled through Path Valley. And it would have looked a lot of the same, you know, other than pavement, of course, but it would have looked very much the same. Just estimating, I'm guessing if they made one big trip with most of their belongings and the family, I would say they probably could have done it in 2 or 3 days. But I wonder if Joseph and some of his sons didn't come up, start planting before, you know, it may have been a more gradual move. I do have them established in what was then Hopewell Township in 1788. And then the land is deeded to them in the early 1790s. Oops, I don't know why it wants me to have a Wi-Fi pass. The interesting part of this whole thing though, is around the time of this move, he was 59 and she was 58. This really rocked my understanding of age and this era. Because I would have imagined in the 1780s, 59 and 58 were the end. And they were making a new beginning. So, one thing I do really want to convey in the story that I never heard of when I was growing up here. There was slavery in Huntingdon County, and Joseph Norris was a slave owner here. The tax records indicate that he paid taxes on multiple occasions on people that he owned. The theory is that one of the younger enslaved people was his biological son. And we can track the life of that young man who remained in Huntingdon. His family remained here for many generations. You know, when the family moved from Maryland to Pennsylvania, at least 2 slaves were brought with them. During his life in Pennsylvania, the records indicate that Joseph owned up to 8 slaves. And in 1780, right around the time he was moving up here, Pennsylvania passed an act for the gradual emancipation of slaves in 1780, which called for enslaved people to be emancipated upon reaching the age of 28. And we can see in the quarter records, which was kind of just an open day at court where people could come in and have miscellaneous business taken care of. We do see that Joseph Norris attended court and registered the birth of a slave. And I will say, I often wonder how, you know, just the complication, but I'm guessing if you're working for survival day in and day out, you don't have a lot of time for contemplation. But I do wonder if Mary ever thought of the irony of the fact that she was an indentured servant and now lived in a slave holding household, and whether that ever struck her or she ever thought more deeply about it. So Joseph and Mary had 12 children, all of whom, for them, I mean, I've not gone with the death dates here, but I was not able to find that any of these children died exceptionally young. Most of them survived childhood, which was really rare for this time period. Most I would say at least 10 of them survived till adulthood to have children of their own, which is why there are so many descendants of the Norris family locally. What I did find really fascinating here as well is looking at the whole timeline of Mary's life laid out, which I did. I put one column of events in Mary's life, one column for events in her family life, and another column for national and world events. And it was really cool to watch those line up and see. Mary was most likely not literate, but what we see in her, the timing of the birth of her children, I'm trying to see which one it is now. Where's William? Okay. Eleanor and William, or no, Elizabeth, I'm sorry. Elizabeth was born in 1750. Mary's sister Elizabeth died in 1749. Now, I could believe that maybe that was just her favorite sister and it was all a coincidence and she always intended to name her first daughter after her sister. Willing to look at that as coincidence, but William Norris was born in 1756 and her father William died in 1755. I'm inclined to think there was some remaining communication, whether it was through people working on the ships that were coming in twice. I mean, John is her first son. If she had intended to name her first son after her father, it would have made sense to do it then. So that to me signals that she had at least some rudimentary knowledge of what was going on at home. This is a page from the family Bible with the names of all the children that Dale so kindly helped me find. So, women have always made history as much as men have not contributed to it. Not only they didn't know what they had made and they had no tools to interpret their own experience. That's a quote from Gerda Lerner, who is known as the mother of women's history. So I'm hoping that Mary will just be the first of the women in my family tree that I can try to do a deep dive and learn more about her. Not that Joseph was not interesting and wonderful, but it's nice. It's very rewarding to research history when you can see yourself reflected in it. And I do think, I think Mary must have been a very strong woman to pick up and move to what would have been night and day from an established city in Maryland to the rough frontier at 58 years old, even with all her family. But that's what I have, and I welcome any questions, and if I can answer them, I will.
It's fascinating. Great journey you had. It's fascinating to think about that.
It is. It's been very interesting to, go out to the lake and look at the ridge line and think, oh, she looked at the same ridge line.
Yeah.
The terrain has changed below the ridge line, but that would remain the same.
Mhm.
And just the fact that, driving through Maryland and up here looking and thinking, oh, she probably passed through the shadow of death in Shade Gap. Because that would have been the pass to get up here. I also wondered too if Joseph told her about the farm's former owners before they dropped in as they were moving in.
Just something little anecdote, where Joseph lived in Maryland, if you look on the map and stuff, you'll see the Potomac River and it has a bend in the Potomac River. And if you take that map and lay it on the Racetown Lake, it's got the same bend of the river. I don't know if that was because it flooded the ground some way or something, but you could swear it was the same topographical, it's weird.
It was probably a comfort thing, but also I'm betting the land was very fertile,
Right.
as was the family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I noticed that.
Interesting that the two daughters whose names were so close.
Yeah.
Well, actually, Ruhana and Ruhama, when you look at the Chaplin family, he was the founder of Sharpsburg. Reading about that family a little bit to get some context, looks like I'm not sure if he was a shrewd businessman or just kind of like, I kind of kept picturing Fezziwig from Scrooge, where he just took everybody in. Sounds like the Chaplin house was like if something had happened or you were passing through and didn't have any place to stay, that was where you stayed. He had a sister, Ruhama, and there was another woman in a house named Ruhana. And those are both biblical names. So I'm thinking Mary knew them. And enough that she named, because it's an odd, where else are you going to find those two names together?
Right.
Which also goes to my theory that she knew what was going on at home because she named children after her relations. So I'm guessing she held those women in pretty high esteem. I can't remember off the top of my head if Ruhana was known as housekeeper, the hostess for her brother.
Since they ended slavery, did they stop the whole bonding servants
That stopped,
program?
yeah, that stopped around the same time. At least in the colonies here. I don't know how long it persisted in Australia, because that was also a huge supply of workers for Australia.
Be interesting to know how many actually came over during that period as indentured. I had sort of forgotten about that.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that a whole lot for this.
I've wondered too, just, I mean, you would have no way of knowing as, well, at male or female, you would have no way of knowing what you're going to get into.
Right.
But as a woman, it's like, am I going to be sold to a brothel? Am I going to be, trapped in a house where somebody's abusive to me? It could be a good situation, it could be a bad situation, and you would have no way of controlling that.
So people in the US paid a certain amount of money to get executive servants over. Yeah. And then after 7 years, they were supposedly
Yeah.
free. That all worked out.
But,
But they could.
sorry, the caveat is if you misbehaved during your indenture, it would extend.
Uh-huh.
So it could become 14 years.
Yeah.
Who did they pay the money to?
Well, usually the shipping, theoretically, the indenture was to pay the cost of the transport.
Transport.
So the right to the person would have gone from the shipping company to whoever purchased the indenture here. That's where the mortgage changed hands. I don't know what it looked like on the England side of things. I don't know if the government was making money, because I don't believe that the government would have just handed these people over and said, 100% profit for you.
Yeah.
When has any government ever done that? So my guess is this was a pretty lucrative practice. Not only are you getting rid of the people you consider less than, you're making money. And you've got people who are realizing my loved ones got shipped to I don't know where, I'm gonna toe the line. So, I mean, but you also had a rise in robbery because desperate people do desperate things. And if you have nothing to lose, you have nothing to lose.
April, if you could sit down and have coffee with Mary, what would you ask her? What's the one thing that you would want to know?
What did you do? That's
Like
like,
on a daily basis?
no, like, oh.
Okay.
I mean, I really wanna believe that it was something,
Does it matter?
it probably doesn't, but as I was combing through the transportation records in her home jurisdiction,
Okay.
some of these descriptions of the things that got, especially the women, they're really like accepted a silver candlestick from somebody,
Okay.
or, you know, slandered another person. So, I mean, there were a few that were, you know, aimed a gun at somebody. But some of these were just like, okay, I would really love to know, like, how did you get to that situation? And then when you were standing in the box, what were you thinking? I mean,
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
like, what is gonna happen to me now?
yeah, like, what did you think? And I guess I'd also wanna know, like, you know, at the end of her life, what would she have told herself?
Her younger self.
Yeah, what would she have
Yeah.
told herself in that moment? Because I do rather believe, Mary outlived all of her siblings by about 20 years. Despite the fact that she was in the middle of the birth order. She also had, I don't wanna say a privileged life, but I'm guessing a lot better than what she had at home growing up. I mean, she would have had food, she would have had a roof over her head, she had a big family. She had, I mean, the unfortunate truth is, if they owned slaves, they were doing better fiscally than most people in this region. There were a few slave owners in Huntingdon County at that time. It was not common, it was present. So I just wonder if she would have told herself, you know, it's gonna be okay. Or run, girl, run, I don't know. But I think to live to 87, generally bitter, angry people don't, that tends to have an effect on your health, so. Also Dale had told me a story about, one of the families of slaves that lived out on the farm. They were hit with smallpox, and the Norris family members were taking boxes of food. So I want to take that as, let me back this up. History is hard because, well, everybody's got warts. You know, there are flaws. And to us standing here today, slavery is an abomination. I'm hoping that the fact that they were taking supplies to this family means that they were empathetic for their day and good. So that's, I don't know if that is the correct response to that or the correct takeaway, but that's the way I look at it. The only thing I can do right now is to educate people that slavery was here. And this is what it looked like. So,
I think going back to your, the records of him having 8 slaves, that was in a certain census here,
yeah,
but I feel he had a lot more than that
Yeah.
because just his family of the Walker. If anybody's ever went on the Racetown Bell when they take the cruise, and they'll talk about the Walker slaves up this hollow. That's who they were, the Walker family, and they mentioned Underground Railroad. They had nothing to do with the Underground Railroad, which I tried to correct me on. But anyway, that was their little house, log house, was between 2 of Joseph Norris's farms. He owned like 8 different farms out there. So I mean, he wasn't, like I said, he wasn't poor. But when they did the censuses every year, you know, it didn't matter who you were you rich or poor, whenever the census taker come, get them cows and horses out of here, hide the slaves. So that might have been the one they caught a few more of the slaves being around, but that's what they did, you know, because you paid taxes on that stuff. The people then, you know, you'd say they only had one cow. And you knew they had more than one cow, but that's what they were, the census taker wrote down. It's hard to tell how many slaves.
It is, and also, I believe that some, or at least one of the slaves had the last name Chaplin. So I believe there was ongoing communication and trade with chaplains back in Sharpsburg. Because, several years ago, for the Daily News, I did a story for Black History Month. There were two brothers who lived in Huntingdon, whose last name were Chaplains. They were chaplains. Their grandmother's maiden name was Norris. She was Violetta, and she was married to Jeremiah, who Jeremiah shows up in the record owning a farm in Shirleysburg. I believe, and I think most people believe, Jeremiah was Joseph's son, and that when he was emancipated, somehow he was set up with money to buy a farm. But his grandsons, one was a painter who painted a lot of well-to-do citizens in Huntingdon and a lot of landscapes. He was also a barber who had the Temple of Fashion on Allegheny Street. It was the place to go. His brother Levi fought in the Civil War, and he provided war correspondence to the newspaper in Huntingdon. And his writing is, I'd say, very reminiscent of Samuel Clemens. The sarcasm is strong, so I'm hoping that came through. And you know, his forefront documentation is very tongue-in-cheek and very subversive. And the newspaper printed it. He even gave himself a promotion in his sign-off line, because there's no record to say that he actually held that rank. But when he was sending things to his hometown paper, he gave himself a promotion, because why not? How am I gonna know?
A lot of people did that.
Yeah. And then he, for many years, he was part of a Wild West show that traveled. So the Chaplains were pretty interesting people. And also descendants of the Morrises.
The descendants of the.
Joseph Morris and, well, not Mary, but Joseph. Yeah.
And that farm was 400 acres, by the way.
Wow.
That was a big farm.
Yeah.
Jeremiah had.
Yeah, not to be crude, I do wonder, like, did it need, I mean, were there signs of a struggle when they moved in? Because I think, I mean, looking at my relationship with my husband, if he dropped a bomb like that on me and I walked into the cabin and I'm going, excuse me. Well, how much did you pay for this? So, I mean, and given that, you know, everybody, I'm sure that, I mean, the story is preserved 300 years later. Well, not like 250, 60. I'm pretty sure the whole region was talking about it when they, you know, can you imagine? Oh, where are you guys farming? Oh, that's where those people died. I mean, that stuff still happens now. But yeah, I think I would have some objections to, although maybe she was very happy there. She had most of her children around her. It does not look like the kids remained in Maryland. So whether that was a slow trickle northward or if everybody pulled up stakes. I hope you enjoyed learning and meeting Miss Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job, April. Thank you. So that is kind of, I'm trying to do this with more of my